If you're interested in partnering with Magical Storybook English Nanny Bedtime Stories or wanting to know more about sponsorship opportunities, then visit our website www.magical-storybook.com. You can also download free read-along books to accompany our fairy tales. Welcome to Magical Storybook, a collection of children's stories from all round the world. Hansel and Gretel. In a deep dark forest, a long time ago, stood a tiny cottage. In this cottage lived a very poor woodcutter, his wife and their 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. His wife was sometimes very cruel and often treated Hansel and Gretel badly. "There's not enough food in this house to feed us all," cried the woodcutter's wife one morning while the children were asleep. "There are too many mouths to feed. You must take Hansel and Gretel far into the forest today and leave them there." The woodcutter begged her to reconsider, but his wife convinced him that someone would find the children and give them a good home. And besides, he felt too hungry to argue, and so eventually he gave in and agreed. What they didn't realise is that Hansel had woken up and heard his mother's plan to leave them in the forest, and so he made a plan of his own. He went out into the garden and secretly filled his pockets with bright white pebbles. Soon the woodcutter called the children and said that they would be helping him to chop wood in the forest today, and Hansel and Gretel followed him. As they went, Hansel took out the white stones one by one and dropped them on the floor, leaving a secret trail which they could follow back home. In the deepest, darkest part of the forest, the woodcutter told the children to wait by an old oak tree while he went off to chop some wood. The children were afraid to be left alone, but they did as they were told. Some hours later, the sun began to set, and the woodcutter still hadn't returned. Gretel began to cry. "Oh, don't worry," said Hansel, and he told her about the trail of pebbles that he had left. Gretel was overjoyed when they found the first stone gleaming in the moonlight, and then they saw the second, and then the third, and eventually they saw their cottage in the distance. When the children ran through the door, the woodcutter and his wife hugged them tightly, but their mother was secretly feeling very angry that they had found their way back. That night, when the children were in bed, they overheard their mother telling their father that he must try to lose the children again, and this time he must not fail. Hansel and Gretel fell asleep, and early the next day when they woke, Hansel crept out of bed to go and collect more stones. But the bedroom door was locked. Soon after, their mother unlocked the door and told the children to come down for breakfast. They were each given a slice of stale bread to eat, but instead of eating it, the children secretly hid the bread in their pockets. When the woodcutter took them out into the forest, Hansel and Gretel broke off pieces of the bread, and as they walked through the trees, they dropped the pieces one by one, creating a trail of crumbs on the floor, so that they could find their way home later. Once more, the woodcutter told the children to wait by the old oak tree while he went to chop wood. And so they did. This time, when night fell and Hansel and Gretel went to find the crumbs, they were horrified to see that they had all gone. "I'm frightened," wept Gretel bitterly, "and I'm hungry and cold. I want to go home." "Oh, don't be afraid," said Hansel. "I'll look after you." And he put his arms around his sister and they huddled up under the tree. But Hansel was scared too, especially when he saw the eerie shadows of the trees and animals moving in the moonlight. Eventually, he closed his eyes and they fell asleep. When dawn broke, the children got up and began to wander through the forest, looking for a path. But they were well and truly lost. On they walked until suddenly, through the trees, they saw a strange but colourful house, all by itself and in the middle of the forest. As they walked nearer, they saw that gingerbread men and lollipops were growing in the garden. How strange, but how magical, they thought. They saw that the window frames were made of candy canes and the door frame was made of biscuits. Hansel and Gretel were so hungry that they began to break off parts of the house and eat them. They tasted everything and found that the windows were made of pure sugar, the walls were made of icing, and the puddles outside the door, well, they were made of pure chocolate. "Isn't it delicious?" said Gretel with her mouth full of chocolate. She had never tasted anything so nice. They were just about to try another piece of biscuit door frame when there was a creaking sound and the door slowly began to open. In the doorway stood an old woman. Her nose was long and twisted, her chin was long and pointed, and her eyes bulged craftily. And as the sun hit her face, Gretel could have sworn that her skin was green. The children stepped back in horror. "Well, well," said the woman. "Children, are you enjoying my house?" Hansel and Gretel said nothing. The old woman raised her finger, which was as long and twisted as her nose, and beckoned them to come inside. "You have nothing to fear," she said. But unluckily for Hansel and Gretel, the woman was a wicked witch, and she used her house made of sweets to lure and trap children. Then she would eat them. The children were in terrible trouble. As Hansel and Gretel entered the witch's house, the witch immediately pushed Hansel into a cage and locked the door. The children screamed, but they were too far away for anyone to hear them. The witch picked up her seeing glasses from the table, looked at Hansel and said, "You're nothing but skin and bones. I shall fatten you up and then eat you." And then she looked at Gretel, "And you can do the housework, and then I'll eat you too." For days, Hansel and Gretel were kept prisoner in the witch's house, and each day the witch would ask Hansel to put his finger through the bars of the cage so that she could feel it and see whether he was fat enough for her to eat. Luckily for Hansel and Gretel, the witch had very poor eyesight and couldn't see much without her glasses. So one day Gretel hid them and handed Hansel a chicken bone so that he could poke that through the cage instead. The witch couldn't see that she was being tricked, and every day when she asked Hansel to hold out his finger, she would feel the chicken bone and say, "You're still much too thin to eat," and she would give him more food. But Gretel was made to go hungry. A week passed, and every day the witch saw that Hansel wasn't getting any fatter, and she grew tired of waiting. "Light the oven," she told Gretel one day. "We will have tasty roast boy today." Hansel was terrified, but Gretel had thought of a plan. She lit the oven and stayed quiet. Until at last the witch shouted, "Is the oven hot enough yet?" Well, Gretel pretended to be confused and said, I don't know how to tell if the oven is hot enough. Will you show me?" Angrily the witch screamed at the girl, "You useless child!" And pulling Gretel out of the way, she shouted, "I'll check for myself." But when the witch bent down and peered into the oven, Gretel gave her a tremendous push, and into the oven the witch went. And then Gretel shut the door and bolted it. The witch had come to an end. Gretel ran to set her brother free. They broke parts of the candy house off and gathered up the witch's huge chocolate eggs and tied them up in a shawl. Then, carrying the shawl over their shoulders, they ran back to the woods. They ran and ran until they found the path, and it took them all the way back home to their cottage. As they ran up to the door, their father ran out to greet them. He said that their mother had left and that she would no longer try and separate them. And they hugged and went inside the house. On the kitchen table, they opened the shawl and broke open the chocolate eggs to share. And out fell hundreds of gold coins. The witch had hid them there for safekeeping. They were rich, and the woodcutter never had to chop wood for a living again.